We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. So you wrote the book Interceptors, the Untold Fight Against the Mexican Cartel, which I have a copy here, obviously.
Oh yeah.
And you know, it's awesome that you wrote a book like that. But then there's quotes that I want to kind of have the listeners, you know, you've mentioned things like the cartel is similar to the Italian mafia. And would you kind of go into detail about that and explain it to the listeners?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's changing now, right? But as I saw it growing up as a kid, because again, I grew up in Phoenix. I grew up in South Phoenix, predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. So I grew up with all Mexicans around that culture. And we had the mafiosos back then before they were actually cartels, because, you know, cartels got kind of put on them later in my life. And so they referred to them as mafiosos. So much like the mafia, the Italian mafia, you had the big bosses. They had certain codes, certain rules they followed, certain rules they didn't break. And they had these gentlemen's agreements and, you know, you knew all this stuff as you grew up and you're in that culture. And then as I got into law enforcement, same type of stuff. You know, there's a hierarchy. There's a lot of familial bonds. So, you know, they don't trust a lot of people in their inner circle unless you have familial bonds or you're from the same towns and you know, you've really been vetted through your life, essentially. So there's a lot of similarities to the Italian mob in that sense and how they operate.
When was the first time you started working on a case that had something to do with the cartel and then you learning like how, I guess, embedded and how intricate their whole system is?
I think it was, I first started doing undercover work in late 2000 into 2001. And I think that's when my eyes were opened to, you always kind of knew they were there, right? But until you know, you really don't know. And that was when my eyes were open to how big it was and how just embedded they are and how much they were involved in everything and how much reach they had. So that was the first time I think I understood, like, man, this is much bigger than I even understood it was. And then even on the international and the global level.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've worked with some of the special operations stuff and some of the things you've done is to kind of target the cartel and their trafficking organizations in that area. You know, I've heard from a lot of different people, but what I try not to like ask a question that can bring harm to anyone in the same aspect, but has the cartels, like whoever manages that area, has it shifted throughout the years? Have you seen changes?
Yeah. Typically speaking, it was all controlled. You know, there's plazas, right? There's plazas in Mexico. There's plazas on the U.S. side. And it all kinds of translates over for who's in charge on the south side and what their routes are going north into the U.S. And those bosses are kind of in control. And so typically speaking, the earlier part of my career, those were all the older mafioso types, and they maintained control of those areas. And you knew which bosses were responsible for which area. Like, seriously, you could look at a mountain range in our county and you knew, like, west of that mountain range, that is this boss. East of that mountain range is this boss. So you knew if you caught loads in certain areas that they belonged to certain crews, because that's the only people that had permission to work those routes. And if you caught somebody that wasn't part of that crew, then they were putting their lives at risk, because, you know, you don't use those routes without permission of those bosses. And it was very controlled in that manner. And those older mafioso bosses, again, had different sets of rules, different goals and objectives. And that was more of the cat and mouse game, right? They were bad guys. They knew they were bad guys. We were good guys. And it was a cat and mouse game. They were trying not to get caught. We were trying to catch them. There were boundaries, right? They typically would not confront us, and we would try and
explain to people, is this weird, like, mutual respect.
Yes.
You know, like, I'm going to do my job,
Right.
You're going to do your job.
Yeah.
And if I fucking catch you, well, that's the way this goes.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly.
It's almost like it's an interesting balance of the good versus evil kind of idea.
Right. Right. And it wasn't, it really was never personal, right? It was, they understood that I am doing my job, and I understood that they were being bad guys, right? And that's their job. And they don't view it, honestly, down there. They don't view it as bad. They view it just as the work they have to do to support their families. And it's us gringos up here in the US that cause this problem because we're the users, and they're just going to supply what we want.
That's an interesting thought, because I've tried to explain to people, like, in other countries, they're not considered drug smugglers. They're more like travel agents. You know what I mean? They're, human smugglers are travel agents. It's a career field.
Yeah.
It's someone chooses that. They create networks, they create relationships, and now they have a streamlined approach to how to get into America. It's not frowned upon in those countries. It's actually looking like that's the guy you go to for that. Oh, and you need tires for your car? Well, then you go to that guy.
Right.
It's one of those kind of systems. And I think some people don't want to connect those dots. If you don't look at it from their perspective, you really don't totally understand why there is a push and pull of this situation. Right. And you're right; they blame it on us, and it is us, right? Yeah. The supply and demand.
Right. Right.
If we're going to be buying all the drugs, well, then there's a whole market for that. Well, and someone's going to. And please go ahead.
And dude, you got to look at the human aspect, right? I'm married to a Mexican, and her family came from Mexico. She's the first.
Sorry to hear that. I'm married to a Puerto Rican, bro. I get it.
I know, right? We're sleeping with one eye open every night because you never know when you're gonna get stabbed, bro. But again, growing up with Mexicans, married to a Mexican, understanding that culture and understanding both sides of the line, for the families that live on that side, on the south side in Mexico, and operate out of Mexico, Americans, quite frankly, are spoiled, bro. They're spoiled, and they don't understand what it's like to live in a country like that, where families still have dirt floors, families don't have running water, they don't have all these things, right? And if the means to get a better life, if they're gonna stay in Mexico, live in Mexico, and the means to get a better life is just driving a car with this product in it into the US and getting paid, they don't view that as bad. They view it as work, right? It's life. And they're just doing life. And and they don't see the effects of that either, right? They're not seeing the overdoses, they're not seeing the family.
Right. They're not thinking long term.
Right.
They're thinking directly in their own circle of like, hey, how am I going to put food on the table?
Yeah.
This is how. Yeah. Okay, so be it.
Right. Exactly.
And look, man, and we sit here from a position of privilege, being able to question that and and even trying to think that, like, oh, that's crazy. But like, we don't sit in a position of struggle. We don't, what I mean? We are very spoiled as Americans, and for me, I'm okay with being spoiled, but I at least have the empathetic views to be like, yeah, I get it.
Right.
I'm still going to try and stop it.
Right.
But I get it.
Well, then when
I worked at the please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, for me, that's the way I approach law enforcement in general, not just dealing with the cartels, but you deal from it from a place of business, right? I'm in a business. I'm a law enforcer. That doesn't mean like I hate the person that I'm enforcing the law against. That means that I just have a job to do. And if I catch you messing up, then I've got to hold you accountable for the laws I'm sworn an oath to protect, right?